"Do not wake her." The words traveled across the royal chamber in a whisper, yet every servant froze as if the walls themselves had spoken. Morning light spilled through towering windows of Blackwood Palace, painting the marble floor in pale gold. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Because for the first time in 147 nights, Alpha King Alexander Blackwood was asleep. And resting peacefully against his chest was an Omega maid no one important had ever noticed before. Before we return to that impossible morning, the story begins 3 days earlier with a girl named Evelyn Carter. Most people in the palace could not have picked her out from a line of servants. She was 22 years old, quiet, hardworking, and almost invisible. While noble daughters arrived in silk gowns hoping to catch the king's attention, Evelyn spent her days carrying linens, polishing silver trays, and cleaning rooms that belonged to people who never learned her name. The palace was a world built on rank and power. Alphas commanded, nobles celebrated, servants obeyed, and Omega maids like Evelyn learned how to disappear. She lived in a small room beneath the eastern wing, a narrow space barely wide enough for a bed, a wooden chair, and a tiny window overlooking the gardens. Yet every morning before sunrise, she rose with a soft smile and began her duties. The other servants often wondered why she never complained. The truth was simple. Evelyn had long ago accepted that kindness was easier to carry than bitterness. Meanwhile, the entire kingdom worried about something far greater than a forgotten maid. Their king was suffering. Alexander Blackwood ruled the northern territories with wisdom and strength, but whispers followed him through every corridor. For months, he had barely slept. Advisors reported that he worked through the night. Physicians came and went. Herbal remedies failed. Special healers traveled hundreds of miles only to leave disappointed. No one could explain why the king's exhaustion continued to grow worse. Some called it a curse. Others believed it was the burden of leadership. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. The king looked tired. And a tired king made an entire kingdom uneasy. Evelyn knew little about palace politics, but even she noticed the change. She saw the concern in the faces of guards. She heard hushed conversations between servants carrying breakfast trays. She noticed how the palace felt quieter than before, as if everyone was waiting for something they could not name. Then came the night that changed everything. A powerful storm rolled across the mountains, rattling windows and shaking ancient stone walls. Rain tapped against the glass while distant thunder echoed across the valley. Somewhere deep inside the palace, an exhausted king searched for a moment of peace. And somewhere else, a forgotten Omega maid finished her final task of the evening. Neither of them knew that destiny had already begun moving pieces into place. By sunrise, the entire palace would be staring at the same unbelievable sight. And the girl nobody noticed would become the one person the Alpha King refused to let anyone disturb. 3 days before that impossible morning, Evelyn Carter moved through Blackwood Palace like a shadow no one bothered to notice. The castle was already awake long before sunrise. Footsteps echoed through endless hallways. Servants hurried between wings carrying baskets, ledgers, and trays. Noble guests arrived almost daily, hoping for invitations to private gatherings hosted by the royal court. Yet among hundreds of faces, Evelyn remained invisible. She preferred it that way. Invisible people rarely became targets. Unfortunately, they rarely received kindness either. As she crossed the southern corridor carrying fresh linens, 2 young noblewomen passed by without slowing. One glanced at Evelyn and immediately looked away as if she were part of the furniture. The other barely concealed her amusement. "The palace keeps hiring more servants every year," she said. "I cannot tell them apart anymore." Their laughter drifted behind them. Evelyn simply lowered her eyes and continued walking. She had learned years ago that dignity was sometimes quieter than defending herself. Outside, gray clouds stretched across the sky. A cold wind swept through the palace gardens, bending rows of white roses beneath the approaching storm. Evelyn paused for a moment near a tall window. She liked watching the gardens whenever she could. The flowers never cared about rank. They bloomed for everyone. "Daydreaming again?" a voice asked. Evelyn turned and found Martha, an older kitchen servant carrying a basket of bread. Unlike most people in the palace, Martha always smiled when she saw her. "Only for a second," Evelyn replied softly. Martha shook her head with affectionate disapproval. One of these days that gentle heart will get you into trouble. Evelyn smiled. It has not happened yet. But even as she said it, something felt different in the air. The palace seemed tense, uneasy. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subject. The king. Throughout the afternoon, whispers spread from room to room. The royal physician had visited Alexander's chambers twice before noon. Several council meetings had been cancelled. A guard stationed outside the western tower claimed the king had not left his private study in nearly 20 hours. No one knew what was happening. Everyone had theories. Evelyn listened quietly while polishing silver in the servant hall. Some believed the king carried a burden too heavy for any man. Others spoke of old legends and forgotten magic. She never joined the conversations. She had never spoken to the king. In truth, she had only seen him from a distance a handful of times. Yet something about those brief glimpses stayed with her. Alexander Blackwood always looked composed, controlled, powerful, but his eyes told a different story. They carried the exhaustion of someone who had forgotten what peace felt like. That evening, rain finally arrived. Thunder rolled across the mountains while sheets of water swept against the palace windows. One by one, servants completed their duties and disappeared to their quarters. Evelyn remained behind to finish organizing a neglected storage room near the royal library. It was tedious work, but she did not mind. The quiet was comforting. Hours passed. The storm grew stronger. Somewhere deep inside the vast palace, a weary king continued searching for rest. And only a few hallways away, an unnoticed Omega maid unknowingly moved closer to the moment that would change both of their lives forever. The storm deepened as the evening stretched toward midnight. Rain raced down the tall windows of Blackwood Palace, blurring the lights of the distant city below. Most servants had already retired to their quarters, grateful to escape the endless duties of the day. Evelyn Carter remained alone in the storage room beside the royal library, carefully stacking records that had not been touched in years. Dust coated her fingertips. Her shoulders ached. Yet she continued working because unfinished tasks always seemed to find their way back to her. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly. 12 slow notes echoed through the silent wing. Evelyn blinked and realized how late it had become. Just a few more minutes, she whispered to herself. She carried another box toward a shelf when a strange sensation made her pause. It was not fear. It was not even a sound. It felt more like a distant sadness drifting through the air. The feeling was familiar. Since childhood, Evelyn had always sensed emotions more strongly than other people. She could never explain it. Sometimes she entered a room and immediately knew when someone was worried. Other times she could feel loneliness hanging around a person before they spoke a single word. Most people would call it imagination. Evelyn had stopped talking about it years ago. Tonight, however, the feeling was unusually strong. Deep exhaustion, quiet frustration, a loneliness so heavy it seemed to fill the walls themselves. She stepped into the hallway and looked around. The corridor was empty. Flickering lanterns cast golden pools of light across polished stone floors. Yet the strange feeling remained. For reasons she could not explain, Evelyn found herself walking toward the royal library. The massive oak doors stood slightly open. That alone was unusual. The library was rarely accessible after dark. She hesitated. Entering would be improper. Still, something drew her forward. The room beyond was enormous. Towering shelves stretched toward the ceiling. Hundreds of books rested beneath soft lantern light. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking the cliffs. The library should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt tired. Evelyn moved quietly between rows of shelves. Then she saw him. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood sat alone near the far window. A single lamp illuminated stacks of open books spread across a large table. His dark coat rested across a nearby chair. One hand pressed against his forehead, while the other held an unopened report. For a moment, Evelyn simply froze. She had never been this close to him before. The stories did not do him justice. There was strength in his posture even now. Confidence. Authority. Yet none of that was what captured her attention. It was the exhaustion in his eyes. He looked as though he had been carrying the weight of an entire kingdom without rest for far too long. Before she could retreat, Alexander slowly lowered the report. His gaze lifted. Their eyes met across the quiet room. Neither spoke. The rain continued outside. Somewhere in the palace, thunder rumbled softly. Evelyn immediately lowered her head. "Your Majesty," she said quietly. "I apologize. I did not realize anyone was here." She expected dismissal, perhaps even annoyance. Instead, several seconds passed in silence. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice sounded calm but tired. "Neither did I." The answer surprised her enough to glance up again. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw something change in his expression. Not recognition, not curiosity, something gentler, as if the relentless tension surrounding him had eased by the smallest amount. Neither of them understood it yet, but for the first time in many months, the king no longer felt completely alone. The silence lingered between them long after the king's unexpected answer faded into the library. Rain continued tracing silver lines down the tall windows, while distant thunder rolled across the mountains. Evelyn stood near the entrance, uncertain whether she should leave or stay. Every instinct told her to excuse herself immediately. Yet something about the room felt different now. The heavy pressure she had sensed throughout the palace seemed less overwhelming here. Alexander studied her for a moment before lowering his gaze to the reports spread across the table. Several candles had already burned low beside him, evidence of another sleepless night. "You should not still be working," he said quietly. Evelyn blinked. Of all the things she expected from the Alpha King, concern was not one of them. "Neither should your Majesty," she answered before she could stop herself. The words escaped so naturally that her eyes widened in alarm. Speaking to the king so casually was unthinkable. She immediately lowered her head. "Forgive me." For a heartbeat, she feared she had gone too far. Instead, something unexpected happened. A faint smile touched Alexander's face. It was brief, almost impossible to notice, but it was there. "Perhaps that is fair," he said. Evelyn stared at the floor, unsure what to do with the strange warmth she felt. Around the palace, people described Alexander Blackwood as intimidating, distant, impossible to approach. Yet the man sitting across the room looked more tired than frightening, more lonely than powerful. She noticed the untouched cup of tea beside him, the cold meal resting on a tray near the bookshelf, the countless documents waiting for his attention. Suddenly, she understood why the sadness she sensed felt so overwhelming. It was not just exhaustion. It was isolation. Without thinking, Evelyn stepped toward the refreshment cart near the wall. "The tea is cold," she said softly. "Would you like another cup?" Alexander looked surprised, not because of the offer itself, but because nobody had spoken to him that way in a very long time. No fear, no ambition, no expectation, just simple kindness. After a moment, he nodded. Evelyn moved quietly through the library. She prepared fresh tea exactly the way Martha had taught her years ago. Warm water, a little honey, a calming blend of herbs often served to restless guests during storms. When she returned, Alexander accepted the cup without a word. Their fingers almost brushed during the exchange, but neither seemed to notice. Instead, something else happened. The tension in the room eased. Slowly, naturally, like storm clouds beginning to drift apart. Alexander took a sip and leaned back in his chair. For the first time all evening, the lines of strain around his eyes softened. Evelyn felt it immediately. The same strange awareness she had experienced since childhood stirred inside her again. The exhaustion surrounding him seemed quieter now. Not gone, just lighter. Neither understood why. Minutes passed. The storm outside continued. The king reviewed reports while Evelyn organized books left scattered across nearby tables. No grand conversation followed. No dramatic moment. Yet the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, peaceful rather than empty. Eventually, Evelyn's eyelids grew heavy. She had been working since before sunrise. Her feet ached. Her shoulders burned with fatigue. Across the room, Alexander was fighting the same battle. One exhausted servant. One exhausted king. Neither noticed how late it had become. Neither realized that for the first time in months, sleep was finally beginning to find them. The storm continued through the night, but inside the royal library the world seemed strangely calm. Rain whispered against the windows. Candlelight flickered softly across endless shelves of books. Somewhere far beyond the palace walls, thunder rolled across the mountains, yet its distant voice felt muted here. Evelyn Carter placed the last book onto a shelf and paused. Her body felt heavier with every passing minute. She rubbed her eyes and glanced toward the king. Alexander remained seated near the window, another report resting unopened before him. His attention had drifted away from the page long ago. Exhaustion surrounded him like an invisible weight. Yet tonight it seemed different. Not as sharp, not as relentless. Evelyn could feel it without understanding why. She crossed the room to return an empty teacup to the cart. When she turned back, Alexander had closed his eyes. For a moment she thought he was simply resting. Then she noticed something unusual. His breathing had slowed. The tension in his shoulders had eased. The constant strain she had seen in every glimpse of him throughout the palace was gone. Not hidden. Gone. Evelyn stared quietly. According to every rumor, the Alpha King had barely slept for months. Yet now he appeared peaceful. Truly peaceful. The realization brought an unexpected smile to her face. She should leave. She knew that. Remaining alone in the royal library after midnight was improper enough. Staying while the king slept was even worse. But as she took a step toward the door, dizziness suddenly washed over her. She had been awake since before dawn. She had worked through the entire day. The warmth of the room and the gentle rhythm of the rain made her eyelids impossibly heavy. Evelyn sat down on a small sofa near the king's table, intending to rest for only a minute. Just 1 minute. The cushions felt softer than expected. Her head leaned back. The candlelight blurred. Across the room, Alexander shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time in 147 nights, sleep had finally claimed him completely. No restless movements. No sudden awakenings. No troubled expressions. Only silence. The kind of silence that comes when a weary mind finally finds rest. Minutes became hours. The storm gradually weakened. Clouds drifted beyond the mountains. Moonlight replaced rain against the windows. Neither of them woke. As the night deepened, something remarkable happened. Alexander slept more peacefully than he had in years. Every servant, physician, and advisor who had tried to help him had failed. Yet somehow, without medicine or ceremony, the simple presence of an unnoticed Omega maid had accomplished what no one else could. Neither of them knew it. Neither of them would remember the exact moment it happened. Sometime before dawn, fatigue pulled Evelyn further into sleep. Her position shifted unconsciously as she sought comfort from the cold. The sofa was narrow. The library chair beside her offered little support. Eventually, guided only by exhaustion, she drifted closer to the nearest source of warmth. Morning remained hours away when the palace finally grew quiet. The candles burned low. Moonlight washed across the library floor. And for the first time in many months, the king dreamed of nothing at all. No worries. No burdens. No endless responsibilities. Just peace. The kind of peace he had almost forgotten existed. Outside, the first faint light of dawn began touching the horizon. Inside the library, 2 exhausted souls remained asleep, completely unaware that by sunrise, the entire palace would be talking about them. Sunrise arrived quietly over Blackwood Palace. Golden light slipped through the towering windows of the royal library, chasing away the last shadows of the storm. For several peaceful moments, the room remained completely still. Then the palace began to wake. Servants moved through distant corridors. Guards changed shifts. Kitchen staff prepared breakfast for hundreds of residents. Everything followed its normal rhythm until a young attendant approached the library carrying the king's morning schedule. The servant pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. What he saw stopped him instantly. His eyes widened. The schedule slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the floor. Across the room, Alpha King Alexander Blackwood remained asleep on the large sofa near the window. That alone was shocking enough. Most palace staff could not remember the last time anyone had seen him resting peacefully. But that was not what left the attendant speechless. Curled comfortably against him was Evelyn Carter. Her head rested against his chest. One of Alexander's arms lay loosely around her shoulders, as naturally as if he had done so 1,000 times before. Both of them were asleep. Both looked completely peaceful. The servant backed away in stunned silence before hurrying into the hallway. Within minutes, whispers began spreading through the palace. More servants arrived outside the library doors. Then guards. Then advisors. One by one, they gathered, each more shocked than the last. No one dared enter. No one knew what to do. Is that really the king? One servant whispered. He is sleeping, another answered. I have never seen that before. The crowd continued growing. Some stared at Evelyn with disbelief. Others exchanged nervous glances. Everyone understood the danger of disturbing the king unexpectedly. Yet the morning schedule could not simply be ignored. Council meetings were waiting. Diplomats had arrived overnight. The kingdom expected its ruler to begin another demanding day. Finally, Lord Bennet Hawthorne, the king's senior advisor, pushed through the gathering crowd. His silver hair was perfectly arranged despite the early hour. His expression, however, revealed complete astonishment. He stepped carefully into the library and studied the scene before him. Even he could hardly believe it. Alexander looked younger somehow. The constant exhaustion had vanished from his face. The tension around his eyes was gone. For the first time in months, he appeared rested. Truly rested. Lord Hawthorne glanced toward Evelyn. A simple Omega maid. Quiet. Forgettable. Invisible to most of the palace. Yet somehow she was standing at the center of an impossible mystery. The advisor hesitated. The king needed to wake eventually. The entire kingdom depended on him. Slowly, cautiously, Lord Hawthorne took a single step forward. Behind him, several servants watched nervously from the doorway. Another step, then another. The room remained silent except for the distant song of morning birds outside the windows. Lord Hawthorne cleared his throat softly. "Your Majesty," he began. Before he could continue, Silver Eyes opened. Alexander woke instantly. Not startled, not confused. Alert, calm. His gaze moved across the room and immediately settled on the crowd gathered at the doorway. Then he looked down. Evelyn was still asleep against him. For one long moment, the library became completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Alexander glanced back toward Lord Hawthorne. His voice was quiet, controlled, yet every person in the room felt the weight behind it. "Do not wake her." The words settled over the library like a royal decree. And suddenly, nobody in Blackwood Palace could remember how to breathe. The silence lasted several seconds after Alexander spoke. No one dared challenge him. No one dared even glance toward the sleeping Omega beside him for too long. Lord Bennet Hawthorne lowered his head immediately. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said. The advisor stepped back. Behind him, servants quickly retreated from the doorway as though they had suddenly remembered a dozen urgent tasks elsewhere. Within moments, the library was nearly empty. Only the king, the sleeping maid, and Lord Hawthorne remained. Alexander watched the door close before looking down again. Evelyn had not stirred. A loose strand of golden-brown hair rested across her cheek. Her breathing remained slow and peaceful. Somehow, despite the chaos unfolding throughout the palace, she continued sleeping without a care in the world. For reasons he could not explain, Alexander found himself relieved. Lord Hawthorne observed the scene carefully. He had served 3 generations of rulers. He had witnessed political scandals, royal celebrations, and countless diplomatic crises. Yet nothing he had seen compared to this. The king looked rested, not simply less tired. Rested. It was a difference large enough to change an entire kingdom. "Your Majesty," the advisor said cautiously, "may I ask a question?" Alexander nodded once. "How long did you sleep?" The answer came immediately. "The entire night." Lord Hawthorne froze. The king had not slept through an entire night in months. Physicians had documented every failed treatment. Advisors had watched his condition worsen week after week. Yet now he spoke as though a miracle had occurred. The advisor's gaze shifted toward Evelyn. "Interesting," he murmured. Alexander followed his line of sight. His expression hardened slightly. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Only an observation, Your Majesty." Lord Hawthorne chose his words carefully. "You have spent months surrounded by healers, scholars, and specialists. None succeeded. Then one evening with a palace maid, and you sleep peacefully until sunrise." Alexander did not answer. Because the advisor was not wrong. He remembered the previous night clearly. The library, the conversation, the tea, the strange sense of calm that had settled over the room. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the constant pressure inside his mind had faded. He looked down at Evelyn again. She certainly did not appear magical. She looked exactly as she always had. Quiet, ordinary, forgettable to most people. Yet something about her presence felt different. Safe, comfortable, familiar in a way that made no sense. Several hours later, news of the morning incident had spread throughout Blackwood Palace. Servants whispered in kitchens. Guards exchanged theories during patrols. Noble guests discussed the matter over breakfast. Some claimed the king had chosen a secret favorite. Others insisted enchantment must be involved. The wildest rumors traveled the fastest. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained completely unaware of all of it. Eventually, sunlight warmed her face. She shifted slightly before opening her eyes. For several seconds, she stared ahead in confusion. The library looked unfamiliar from this angle. Then awareness returned all at once. Evelyn sat upright, so quickly she nearly lost her balance. Her eyes widened. Across from her sat Alpha King Alexander Blackwood, calmly reviewing a document as though nothing unusual had happened. But the faint amusement hidden in his silver eyes told a different story. And for the first time since arriving at the palace, Evelyn suddenly felt as though her invisible life was about to change forever. For the rest of that morning, Evelyn felt as though the entire palace had suddenly turned its attention toward her. Every hallway seemed quieter when she entered. Conversations stopped when she passed. Servants who had barely acknowledged her existence now stared openly. By lunchtime, she understood why. The story had spread far beyond the library. People were whispering about the king, about the impossible night of sleep, and about the Omega maid who had somehow been at the center of it. Evelyn wished she could disappear again. Unfortunately, the palace had other plans. As she carried fresh linens through the western wing, she noticed groups of noblewomen gathered near the balconies overlooking the gardens. Their elegant dresses shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Their voices remained soft enough to avoid direct accusations, but loud enough for her to hear. "It is strange, is it not?" one woman remarked. "Months of specialists failed, yet one servant succeeds." Another gave a delicate laugh. "Perhaps she is more ambitious than she appears." Evelyn lowered her gaze and continued walking. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She had done nothing. She barely understood what had happened herself. Yet somehow she had become the subject of rumors she could not control. Later that afternoon, Martha found her organizing supplies near the laundry room. The older servant's expression was unusually serious. "You need to be careful," Martha warned. Evelyn blinked. "Careful of what?" Martha glanced around before lowering her voice. "Jealous people." Evelyn frowned. "I have given them no reason to be jealous." Martha sighed. "That rarely matters." Across the palace, the rumors continued growing. Some nobles insisted the king's improved condition must be temporary. Others demanded explanations. A few influential families had spent years hoping their daughters might one day gain Alexander's attention. The idea that a simple Omega maid had accomplished something none of them could understand made many people uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Alexander spent the day in meetings he normally would have endured through sheer determination. Yet today felt different. He was focused, clear-minded, rested. Advisors noticed immediately. So did visiting diplomats. By evening, even the royal physician had quietly admitted that the king appeared healthier than he had in months. Lord Hawthorne watched these developments with growing interest. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time Evelyn entered a room, the tension surrounding Alexander seemed to ease. Every time she left, the familiar strain slowly returned. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. That night, after finishing her duties, Evelyn stepped into one of the palace gardens. The air smelled of roses and fresh rain. Lanterns glowed softly along winding stone paths. For the first time all day, she felt alone. She welcomed the silence. Then she heard footsteps approaching. Evelyn turned and immediately froze. Alexander stood a few yards away beneath the golden lantern light. He wore a simple dark coat instead of formal royal attire. For a moment neither spoke. The evening breeze stirred the flowers around them. Finally, the king broke the silence. "There you are," he said quietly. The words were simple, yet something in his voice made Evelyn's heart skip, because it sounded less like a king addressing a servant and more like someone who had been looking for her. For a moment, Evelyn could only stare at him. The lantern light painted soft gold across the garden path, while the evening breeze carried the scent of roses through the air. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood stood before her, the most powerful man in the kingdom, looking at her as though she were the person he had hoped to find all evening. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, lowering her head. Alexander stepped closer, not enough to make her uncomfortable, only enough that she no longer felt as though an entire world separated them. "You keep calling me that when we are alone," he said. A faint smile touched his lips. "Old habits are difficult to break." Evelyn almost smiled in return before remembering who she was speaking to. "I am only a servant." The words left her mouth automatically. She had believed them for so long that they felt like part of her identity. Yet something changed in Alexander's expression when he heard them. "No," he said softly. "You are not only a servant." The garden fell silent. Evelyn looked up. For the first time, she saw complete certainty in his silver eyes. Not curiosity, not confusion. Certainty. Earlier that day, Lord Hawthorne and the royal physician had presented their observations. The facts were impossible to ignore. Every hour spent near Evelyn improved Alexander's condition. His mind felt clearer. His exhaustion eased. The constant burden he had carried for months seemed lighter whenever she was present. Yet none of that was the reason he had searched for her. The truth was simpler. He enjoyed being around her. Her kindness expected nothing in return. Her presence brought peace into rooms that had forgotten how to be peaceful. Around her, he felt less like a king and more like himself. "The palace is talking about me because of what happened," Evelyn admitted quietly. "Some people are angry. I know. Others think I did something wrong." Alexander's gaze hardened slightly. "You did nothing wrong." Evelyn looked away. That does not stop them from believing it. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then footsteps echoed from the nearby path. Several nobles emerged from around a hedge, stopping abruptly when they noticed the king. Their surprise quickly turned into awkward bows. Alexander recognized them immediately. They were among the people spreading rumors throughout the palace. The nobles lowered their heads respectfully, but their eyes drifted toward Evelyn. The familiar judgment was impossible to miss. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. She took a small step backward. Alexander noticed. And in that moment, something inside him settled completely. He was tired of whispers, tired of assumptions, tired of watching people overlook someone who had shown more compassion than most of the court combined. Slowly, he offered Evelyn his hand. The garden became perfectly still. Her eyes widened. So did everyone else's. "Come here," Alexander said. His voice was calm, but it carried the unmistakable authority of a king. Evelyn hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. The moment she did, Alexander turned toward the watching nobles. "For years," he said, "many of you have measured a person's worth by rank, titles, and influence." No one dared interrupt. You looked at Evelyn Carter and saw a servant. His fingers tightened gently around her hand. I looked at her and found the one person who reminded me how to breathe again. Shock flashed across every face. Alexander continued. "From this day forward, she will be treated with the respect she has always deserved." The nobles immediately lowered their heads. Across the garden, servants and guards who had gathered nearby stood frozen in disbelief. Evelyn felt tears threaten to form, but she blinked them away. Not from sadness, from relief. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her completely and chosen not to look away. Above them, the clouds finally parted. Moonlight spilled across the gardens, silver and bright. And as the kingdom watched, the invisible Omega maid was invisible no longer.